Here we go, it's official. Welcome, folks, to tonight's presentation of two of the latest Phoenix Poet Series authors, Michael Collier and Chiyuma Elliott. We'll be reading from their new books tonight. These beautiful things right here. My name is Adrienne Myers. I'm from the University of Chicago Press, where both of these books are published. And this event is being hosted as part of the Press's By the Book virtual event series in partnership with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, an invention of the pandemic times. So as I mentioned a second ago, the event will be recorded. So if you would please keep your microphones muted during the event. At the end, we'll have chat time and feel free to unmute and ask questions and things then. But while the reading is happening, please stay muted, camera on, off, whatever suits your fancy. And in a second, I'll pop in the chat links to both books so you can purchase at the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. They are a wonderful bookshop here in Chicago. We want to support them as much as we can. I'll also post a link to our YouTube page where this event recording will end up being available. Okie dokie. And now for the important bits, our two readers tonight. First up, we'll have Michael Collier, who's the author of 8 collections of poems, including An Individual History, which was a finalist for the Poets Prize, and The Ledge, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Maryland and Emeritus Director of the Middlebury Loaf Writers Conferences. He has received numerous honors, including a fellowship from the Guggenheim Foundation and an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And he was the Poet Laureate of the state of Maryland from 2001 to 2004. He currently lives in the beautiful state of Vermont. Chiyuma Elliott, or Chai, is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of At Most, California Winter League, and Vigil. A former Stegner Fellow, Elliott, I've got all my words messed up. Elliott has published poems in the African American Review, Notre Dame Review, PN Review, and Callaloo, among others. She's received fellowships from the American Philosophical Society, Canem, and the Vermont Studio Center. So Michael is going to start us off reading. We'll turn it over to Chai, and then we'll have time for all of you to ask questions at the end. If anything comes to mind, feel free to post it in the group chat, or you can wait and unmute yourself at the end if you prefer. All right, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Adrienne. And Chai, it's great reading with you and meeting you as well. And Adrienne, thanks for all the work you've done to support our books. It's been really a terrific experience working with you. So thanks for that. The book I'm going to read from is called The Missing Mountain, and it is a new and selected poems. When I was trying to figure out what to read for you this afternoon, it was a real quandary. You know, do I read one poem from each book? Do I kind of read a couple poems here, a couple poems there? And I ended up just being sort of hogtied by that quandary. But what I am going to do is we're going to read the title poem, and then a few poems from the selected part, and then 3 poems from the new poem part. I'm at my son and daughter-in-law's house in Seattle, and there are house painters around, and supposedly they know I'm in this one room, but I see them passing by. But I really like it because I spent a number of years as a house painter. And so I like having them near me. You might see them move past, I guess is what I'm saying. The Missing Mountain. Cars could reach the mountain's saddle, a notch between 2 peaks, and there survey the grid of lighted streets, a bursting net of beads and sequins, a straining movement, cruising for release. As far as the eye could see, though few cared to look, was across the valley to the other mountains, whose ridge stood gaffed with broadcast towers, bright harpoons quivering out our songs. Oh, wouldn't it be nice? The Beach Boys harmonized, and it was. Sometimes I saw the Milky Way invade the grid, Andromeda, Draco, great Betelgeuse, bridging the avenues and lanes, filling up acres of vast parking lots. Sometimes I stared powerfully into space where glowworms of matter spun in pinwheels of gas. What did it mean to be alive? A voice asked. What did it mean to have a voice speaking from inside? Once I found a cockpit canopy from a fighter jet in my neighbor's yard, where it had fallen from the sky. No one ever claimed it, such a large, specific, useless thing, like the shoe a giant leaves behind, like a mountain from childhood, missing or pulverized. It leaves a shape that once you see it, overwhelms the mind, or makes a cloud that is the shape of what the mountain was, the seafloor covered with the sea. Oh, wouldn't it be nice, I used to sing, and the mountains all around me answered, but not the question I had asked. I was born and raised in Phoenix and Arizona, and the cover of the book shows Phoenix at night, which is the landscape I had in mind for that poem. This is called An Individual History, and it's the title book, the title poem of the book, An Individual History. It's about my maternal grandmother. This was before the time of lithium and Zoloft, before mood stabilizers and anxiolytics, and almost all the other psychotropic drugs, but not before Thorazine, which the suicidal Lachlan called handcuffs for the mind. It was before, during, and after the time of atomic fallout, Auschwitz, the Nakba, DDT. And you could take water cures, find solace in quarantines, participate in shunnings, or stand at Lourdes among the canes and crutches. It was when the march of time kept taking off its boots. Fridays, when families prayed the living rosary to neutralize communists with prayer. When electroshock was electrocution, and hammers recognized the purpose of a nail. And so, if you were as crazy as my maternal grandmother was then, you might make the pilgrimages she did through the wards of state and private institutions, and make of your own body a nail for pounding, its head sunk past quagmires, coups d'etat, and disappearances. And in this way, find a place in history among the detained and unparoled. An individual like her, though hidden by an epoch of lean notation, marked Parkinsonian tremor, chronic paranoid type, a time when the animal, slowed by its fate, was excited to catch a glimpse of its tail, or feel through her skin her dulled overjoy, when for a moment her hands were still. And I mentioned that I went to a Jesuit high school. So I'm kind of like completely saturated by Catholicism. And I'm going to read this poem. It's called My Crucifixion. Not blasphemy, so much as curiosity and imitation suggested I lie face up and naked on my bedroom floor, arms stretched out like his, feet crossed at the ankles, and my head lolling in that familiar, defeated way, while my sisters worked with toy wooden hammers to drive imagined spikes through my hands and feet. A spiritual exercise? I don't think so. For unlike Christ, my boy-sized penis stiffened like one of Satan's fingers. I was dying a savior's death, and yet what my sisters called my thing struggled against extinction, as if its resurrection could not be held off by this playful, holy torture, nor stopped, except by the arrival of my parents, who stood above us suddenly like prelates, home early from their supper club, stunned but not astonished to find the babysitter asleep and the inquisitive nature of our heathenish hearts amuck in murderous pageantry. That's what passed for play at my house. I think I'll read one more poem from the selected, and then read the few new poems. This is called Boom Boom, and it's, I guess you would call it a prose poem. One of the things I hope that Chai and I talk about is a kind of elusive texture of many of our poems. I think we both write with other poets in mind, other artists in mind, and they're threaded through. And sometimes you're aware of it, sometimes you aren't. But it's part of this larger conversation with art and poetry. And this poem, Boom Boom, responds to a passage from Neruda's diary. And in fact, the first sentence is from Neruda's diary, kind of more or less. Boom Boom. I leave my backyard and enter the alley in search of my poetry. I get lost a few houses down near the Eldridges because all the fences and trash cans are identical. I am alone filling a shirt pocket with the bees David Hills eviscerates by pulling out their stingers, and which he has lined up on a flap torn from a cardboard box that's pinned to the ground with 4 small stones. In a toolbox, I have a small hammer and screwdriver for taking things apart. Above me is the sky that is always blue. This means at night, the stars are what I see but can't count. The alley is dirt. My shoes scuff its uneven surface. Suddenly, a door opens. A dog barks. It is Boom Boom, a chihuahua. Not even a dog in my mind. It rushes its side of the fence and is so much louder and fiercer than it needs to be. After a while, it stops. Now it sounds like a tambourine because of a collar with tiny bells. Passion flowers grow in a thick vine over Boom Boom's fence. I have been told the leaves of these flowers are the lances that pierced Jesus's chest and broke his legs. Boom Boom is whimpering, lying down near a place in the fence through which I squeeze my hand to touch his nose. Boom Boom, I say, very quietly. I love you. You are the only one who understands me. Afterwards, I feel very small and very large, restrained and freed, and certain there is a purpose to life beyond the one I've been given. This poem is called A Man of Rueful Countenance, and it opens the section of new poems. I woke up in the desert, which does not mean I had come to my senses, but found, although I knew how to pray, I had nothing to pray with. I had lived a chivalrous life, opening doors for women and children and men, nodding my head for them to pass, offering my seat whenever I could. Although the needle of my vision was true to the path of my calling, staying on track required constant correction and a steady belief in my fellow humans. A man like myself lives by quests, not crusades. And so I tore off the tail of my shirt and tied it in knots to serve as a rosary. If I had been a sinner, a criminal, or a thief of my own soul, I would have made a scourge of my shoes studded with spines and flayed myself all the way to the skull of Golgotha. But my sins have been mild, and for that harder to cleanse, except by device and resourcefulness. Like the rosary, I worry with my hands, its beads caressed by words from my lips. The sun is hot on my skin. Penance is a circle and circular, like faith overlaid on axe. When I get to the end, to the crucifix of matchsticks, I begin again with the glory be, the sorrowful or joyful mysteries. It should be easier to love, more difficult to hate. But looking up, I see the desert is full of people walking in circles, saying the prayers they know how to say. Goat on a pile of scrap lumber. He lowers his head like a fur-covered anvil, as if he knows all things in the world change. His eyes are bisected by a horizon line of yellow light. You're wondering what would happen if you move closer. There's a language we speak to ourselves and one we use for others. I told you, he's lowered his head. Nevertheless, you can see for yourself he's chewing. What he swallows becomes his rumination. I too was attracted to someone I did not understand. With each other, we were bestial. That's not too strong a word. Although at first, when our foreheads touched, we were curious. And then I'll end with this poem called Tree Beyond Your Window. One day you look up and all that's left of leaves is a twisted trunk, thick at the base, an obelisk split at the top like an ungulant's hoof, a shaft riddled with holes, hopeful places for birds to make their fastidious nests. And if you look closer, you'll see a tortoise, head as big as a howitzer shell, and two legs, trying calmly to swim out from the leathery bark of which it's made. It wants to know, like an accuser in a dream, what have you done with your life? And raising its rough, amphibious hands, holding them out, implores you to pull its ancient body from the tree. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, Michael, I'm so excited that I was hoping you would read the Boom Boom poem. I mean, I wasn't going to weigh in on that ahead of time, but like, I think I can see why it would be hard, right, to pick what you read from this book, partly because, I mean, you work in so many long poems, right? You do these incredible poem sequences and you can't really share those in a small bit of time. But there's just so much, there's so much here. I also love A Man of Rueful Countenance. So it's like on my list of poems that I just hoped you'd read magically, like two of them were there. So
Oh,
I'm feeling like a very lucky individual at this point. So I'm going to start with a poem called A Warning. There are plenty of cautionary tales, so here's another. If the sea was a coat, then I was its sleeve. If the sea was a sleeve, I was its loose button. There are plenty of warnings about seeing yourself in water. I was also the bird and the smelt in its mouth. If I'm crazy for feeling so, what about how the rain seeps into the coat you almost didn't bring because of all that sunlight? Maybe I began by making paper boats. If I let go of the boats, then they bobbed as if nodding to different songs. There are a lot of song poems in this book. One of the challenges that I gave myself was writing a bunch of ekphrastic poems about jazz songs, especially avant-garde jazz songs, things that I loved really, really deeply, and that I had, but in doing that, I created this sort of weird conundrum, right? How do you write a poem that describes a song? One of my poetry heroes is Langston Hughes, and in his quest to do that, he invented the Blue Stanza. That's the kind of thing that happens, right? When we posit these analogies between creative forms. I drove my dogs absolutely batty writing the title poem for this book that I didn't know was going to be the title poem for anything. Chad is laughing because he knows my dogs and he knows what happens, right, when they're driven completely insane. So this is Blue and Green, my version of it, my remix. It has an epigraph from Maggie Nelson from Bluets, and here's how the epigraph reads. Stop working against the world, I counseled myself. Love the one you're with. Love the color green. So blue and green. I imagined mornings, 2 plates, a worn table, nights a composite of the same small things. I chronicled the history of segregated boardwalks. I stirred my coffee with improbable plastic straws. I imagined falling on a slick surface. No, you held fast. Or maybe you stood on tiptoe and blew smoke out the high bedroom window. Maybe we were arguing about paintings. Maybe I just imagined the digressions. Your letter read, Dear Day in mid to late October. Of course, I concluded there was never any ballast. The clocks fell back. The euphorbia argued their case in simple terms. What happened? I watched the sky. I stood on tiptoe. I downplayed the mystery. I carried it in a compartment of my purse. A lot of poems that I end up making happen because there's something that I found on a walk, or that I experienced on a walk. I used to live down the street from an elementary school that had, the little sort of billboards out front, like it's not a sandwich board. I can't think of the actual word for these things, where they have mottos. Like every week there'd be a different sort of motto or a different quote from a famous person. Sometimes it's somebody from the Muppets. Sometimes it's like somebody from the United Nations, kind of in true elementary school style. Things like that end up working their way into poems. And so did this neighborhood. There was an old railroad that had been made into a walking and biking trail in Oakland by my old house. And this is one of the poems that came from these walks. And this was on after a particularly smoky season. It's called Tinder. There is only forgiveness and its absence, a whetstone, awkward slide into image. There are only trees and the absent sounds they make. For instance, the eucalyptus. I had not walked for days, and it fell across the ravine. Then the smoke cleared. Now I can reach up and touch it like I cannot touch even people I know quite well. And the places an intrepid bird drilled holes before doing other things, even those. The acid green inside a newly separated acorn cap. A hymn to evenness, the mulch in 2 large piles by the staid buildings. If forgiveness were botanical, my hands would find odd bits of metal tossed along the path, and the wind, in its weird way, quite innocent. I met somebody in a hospital waiting room the other week who misses eucalyptus trees. She now lives in Cincinnati, and she misses the creaking sounds that they make, and that makes utter sense to me as a longtime Californian. Yeah. So I'm going to read you another ekphrastic. Those of you who are jazz fans will know how insane it is that I thought that it was a really good idea to start writing a bunch of ekphrastic poems about Anthony Braxton compositions. But you know, I had to do that, right? I had to honor it. I had to try. This one is called J572431I. In the original, we were reputed to feed on sand. The sky was our street. We were called a tassel. We were the emblems of border guards and coopers. You beheld time in me. We were manipulated like cattle. We huddled together for warmth. The sky had lights and cloverleaf interchanges. We were manipulated with rosewater. We genuflected in winter. The sky had lanes and headstones, pine trees and chimes. Composition number 311. I am the bluest blue. I am the coat. I am the shoe. Do you often know what to do? Maybe this is a test for you. Water, water, water. Maybe this is a nest for you when I say melody equals true and each one's a song. Composition number 152. Maybe the song is a fluke, or maybe it means a dramatic view, or it drinks from the lake and tells something true, true. During certain harvest festivals, the pattern can be found inside geodes and tendons. During certain harvest festivals, the pattern can be found inside June sun and April wind, or maybe it means I will be as the sky is blue to you. There are a lot of poems in this book called When I Was a Wave. This is one of them. When I was a wave, the narcissus bloomed early, as if by consensus. One lush winter, and they were all in hysterics. The birds repeated, hey sailor, hey sailor. The nights were separated into before and after. As if I wanted that riot. I turned pages and noticed in this order, bowl, apple, storm. And then there was a live, uncomplicated hour. Love willed it so. And the nights were separated into before and after. The last poem I'll read is the last one in the book. It's called For Ghosted Girls. We need a new name for the doubt. They say azure here, but blue will do. We need a new name for north, a name for south, a name for this place where the tide rolls out, a name for tales of tall black pots, for button willows and forget-me-nots. We need a new name for lips, a new name for eyes, a name for waking up slowly to the disguise the fog makes, for hills and streets and damp, a new name for lists and listing and listless and why me and why us. Hey, thank you. Thank you for letting me share poems with you.
Thank you both so much. It's unmatched being able to hear the poems actually being read by the poets. And I'm so grateful we got to hear both of you read tonight. We have time to just chat since we're a pretty small group. If you want to just unmute yourself and toss out any thoughts or questions, feel free to go ahead. Or if you prefer to put things in the chat, we can read it out on your behalf, whatever suits your fancy.
We have so many amazing makers just in this Zoom room right now. I mean, there's so many just extraordinary artists. I'm like excited to just hear people talk. And if you want to just share stuff, like, what are you all making? Like, what are you making right now? Like, what's on your mind? What are you reading? Like, I miss being in the room and getting to like have those conversations with fellow writers, with fellow makers.
Well, I want to ask you a question about the work, which I think is so beautiful. And I could be wrong about this because like I don't know that much about jazz, but it feels like in jazz, like digression is a huge part of the movement of the music. Am I correct about that?
I think there can be, yeah.
I guess my question was like, how does digression like play itself into some of the ekphrastic poems, like writing these poems inspired by these specific pieces of music?
I love that question, Kimmy. What I was really interested in, what made me even think it would be a good idea to try to write these poems, had to do with repetition, which I think can actually weirdly be a form of digression, right? Like there's a way to when you repeat certain phrases, repeat fragments or modified versions of certain phrases, like like Anthony Braxton does a lot, you know, in the work, it can actually feel like a kind of like a digression, and then all of a sudden the repetition actually you realize that it's taken you somewhere, and all of a sudden, and you shouldn't, and like that shouldn't have happened. And that's actually one of the things that I'm so interested in, right? How do we get a poem to act like that? How do we leverage? And in my case, like I kept trying, it seemed like rhyme was the vehicle, right? Like direct phrasal repetition, and also certain rhymes, like sonic things. Like, can I get a similar syllable count and get the sound of, you know, whatever vowel sound to hit multiple times in these lines, and then slightly shift it. And so it creates that feeling, right, of like all of a sudden realizing that you're somewhere purposeful. And you didn't realize you were there, kind of like the feeling of walking along and like seeing the acorn cap, right? Like, and just all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, I'm just like meandering. I'm not doing this with a kind of force or tension or something. And then all of a sudden, exactly the thing that I needed for whatever reason is right there. Kimmy, will you talk about digression in your poems? Because I actually.
No,
Yeah,
this is not the space to talk about my poems.
I always
feel like your poems, these poems in this book teach me so much about like digressions and sound. Like I love some of the very short little poems that you read that are in the book, and they're like snapshots of sound as much as they're describing, like the one that repeats blue often. So no, this book, I mean, I use repetition a lot in my work. As you know, Chai is one of my very best friends and I love her so much. But yeah, these poems are teaching me about digression. That's why I wanted to hear you talk about it.
You know, if I could say something about the idea of digression, although I think of it slightly different in ekphrasis, is, you know, we think of ekphrasis a lot of time as looking intensely at something, which I think is where it begins, or listening to something. But really what we're doing is breaking it down and reassembling that. And I think that's your technique is to use a kind of digression. And it is musical. We were talking about music before everybody came on, I think. And the idea that you listen to people improvising as a child, you heard that as a method of making and creating. And I think it's just natural, wouldn't it be, to have it carry over into your own work?
I love that idea. You know, the other thing I feel like I want to do is give a shout out to Chiku Reddy's book on digression. I don't know if everybody's read this thing about drift. That is so flipping smart, right? I mean, one of the things that, like, why as a poet, I mean, I'm also a literary critic, right? That's one of my jobs, right? But as a poet, I read literary criticism like this book, and I hope somebody remembers. I'm not remembering the title. I almost like want to run across the room, like grab it off the shelf and hold it up, because I can't. I'm forgetting, you know, the exact title of Chiku's book. But I love reading that kind of criticism because it gives me all of these, basically like these poem prompts or these experiments. It's like, oh, okay, so this is how Whitman is creating, changing subjects. Yeah, Oddity read it. Yeah, okay, awesome. So it's this really amazing, gorgeous book, right? And so thinking about, okay, so how is Whitman doing this? Like, and also kind of what are the political purposes for digressing? I mean, I think that's something that Chiku's book does. It has this incredible set of arguments about, like, what is the political heft of digression in this particular book. One of the things I care about is race in medicine. I care about racism in medicine. I care about anti-Blackness and how it manifests in people's bodies, right? And so one of the challenges is figuring out, okay, so can I tell that story, not just using digression within individual poems, but sort of creating other kinds of digressive narratives-ish, lyric patterns, things like that, so I can actually maybe surprise readers, tell a kind of compelling story through not telling stories or something. Like there is like a, I don't want to say method because it makes it sound like it was something that I had practiced and have some sort of mastery over, and I don't think I do, but there was certainly an intention there. I love being surprised as a reader. So this is one of the ways to make that, I think. I don't know if people see in the chat, Adity's like, changing subjects. She's like, it's on the shelf behind me. It is such a great book.
Vicente, you had a hand up?
Yes, thank you, Adrian. I'm wondering if the readers today can talk a little bit about their approach to things like after poems. What does it really mean, you know, as like scholars and writers, to be writing after previous poets? I wonder if you could talk about it in a way that like young writers can be thinking about it. I'm wondering if it's like the scholarly practice where it's related to citations and who you cite and who you're in conversation with. I'm just wondering what your approach is to after poems and models after other poems. How do you go about deciding how close of a resemblance you create and stuff like that?
Well, one thing I liked about in looking at Chai's notes in the back of her book is that she uses phrases like remix and riff, which are music. We think of that in terms of musical, in relationship to music. I think it also updates the idea of using somebody else's, you know, material to create your own. I find more and more that other art just seeps in and to my work. I can't keep it out as I get older. And it's kind of a joy for me. It also feels, if I had been doing it 20 or 30 years ago, I might have felt a little more self-conscious about it. But I realize now, you know, after a while, it's just all one big, you know, washing machine that we're in of language. And we get mixed around in it and we absorb it. It's a conversation really that we're involved with. And it's also very particular. It seems to me that it can't be replicated. You know, nobody's after poems are like anybody else. Nobody's influences are like anybody else, because it creates a kind of DNA for you. And it's one of the things I particularly enjoyed, you know, in your poems, Chai, is seeing all of that, because I've been doing it for a while as well. And it also made me realize I'm old enough, let's say, to remember when people were still outraged about Elliott's notes in the wasteland. And it seems so crazy now that you would be outraged by them. But there were particular reasons why people were. Now, because we really don't have a common education, it seems to me it really gives a map to a reader of our own, our own literary world that we put together.
I like that, Vincente. I love the question. When you were first asking it, when you're writing after poems, I was thinking, okay, so what are the poems that that I really do think of my life sort of before and after meeting that poem? And I think the first time that I really vividly, viscerally had that reaction was actually I remember sitting at a bus stop and reading a poem, really, and now, of course, this is so embarrassing. The author's name has just totally jumped out of my head. She's super famous, and I bet everybody's read like multiple things of hers. There are these kind of Jory Graham, these massive enjambed lines in the middle of these poems, and I was sitting there, and the bus that I was, was late, and I was just reading, and I was reading and reading, and I remember just putting the book down like a third of the way through, and I was like, it has been done. Like there will be no more poems. Like she had solved something about the way a poetic line worked. And it just, for me as a reader, I had never met that particular solution before. And I was just like, yeah, it's just done. It's like, we can stop now. Like we have learned this thing. So for me, that's part of the before or the after of the poem. That question about how close, right? Or how far, I do feel like some of my models really, I mean, it comes from growing up in just like on that bridge between analog and digital, and in the age of sampling, right? Like these artists who are, using riffs and snippets of music, snippets of song, and remixing and reincorporating those. There's something, I mean, yes, there's a way to do that where you are stealing in a very negative sense. And then there's also the sense of homage, right? For me, I feel like that's the beautiful task that every poem that's elusive or referential has to decide it has to solve for itself. Like how close, how important is it that a reader know what the reference is? It seems to be like a calculation about risk. As I'm saying this, Peter, I'm thinking about the reading that you did in the same series, like not so many months ago, where like you took risks, right? You were reading some really elusive poems, and I noticed one thing about your reading is that you were really careful to explain some of the classical references in, just in the conversation. And it felt to me as a listener that was incredibly generous to do, because it was like you were bringing your audience along. One of my favorite poems in the whole entire world is Yusuf Komenaka's poem Facing It, which is this ekphrastic poem. And it's describing the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. I had this experience teaching that poem in a class years ago where, rookie teacher mistake, right? I had just assumed that everybody had seen a picture of this, at least of this huge and important piece of art, this memorial on the National Mall. But a lot of my students hadn't. And that poem seemed utterly wild and impressionistic and just like digressive in ways that they couldn't map it visually. Like they had a totally different experience with that poem. I think that Komenaka's poem is one of the most brilliant things I've read any poet make ever. But part of it is he took a risk with the references, right? And allowed there to be a certain amount of distance. So yeah, like writing after, how close.
Can I say something else? Vincente, I think part of it also has to do with this sense of humility towards what you're writing after, that ability to create a relationship between yourself, which honors the material without assuming that it's yours. And that has to do with temperament and character, it seems to me. And then this other thing that Chai is talking about, which is passion and enthusiasm. So that's why I say 30 years ago, I would have thought, no, you can't really just take these lines and thread them in. And now I do it all the time. And sometimes I make a note of who said it. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't.
I live in fear of forgetting that I've done that. So I have marks all over pages and notes and all kinds of places. Vam Jordan was the poet who made me think about this, I think, in a more, I don't know, maybe a more practiced or a more deliberate way. He told me that he made soundtracks, he made playlists for his classes. I mean, whether or not he shared those with students, like there was a playlist that went along with that. And we sort of had this conversation about who is it that you're talking to while you're making, like, who are you in conversation with? As a Black artist, one of the things that is most important to me are stories about literary history, right? And I think that part of that is telling stories about ancestors, like making sure the stories stay, making sure that we repeat them, and also telling stories that are wild and beautiful and capacious about who we think we're in conversation with, like who's part of our literary universe. I am betting that everybody in this room, right, in some way, shape, or form has been pigeonholed in their life because of, whatever identity, or like the way that some other like person or people imagine their identity, like, oh, well, here's your box, here's the box you should be in, here's who's part of the story that you're telling, or here's who should be important to you or something. And I think that allusion and reference and like writing after poems, right, is a way of declaring a kind of declaring a big space for Black art, for Black making, right? And hopefully like a more nuanced space than what maybe the popular culture wants to think we are and do. I don't know, it seems important to me. It seems like standing in relation, like Michael's saying, that there's a playfulness, right? There's a joy, there's a deep respect. I hope that I get to the point where I feel the kind of ease, with that, and how that connects, like using other people's words and phrases and having those like feel and sit like really comfortable in things that I'm making. I'm not there yet. It's more, it's messier for me.
I think also quite often there's, even if you're working with illusion, that it might not be overt, and it doesn't necessarily have to be. I guess what I'm talking about is the sort of private relationship of any artist has to the thing that they're making, because someone in the audience or a reader only sees this one version of it. But our relationship to it is much, much different. And we remember mostly every stage of the way, right? And that process is ours, and it's fairly private, really, but it's incredibly rich, it seems to me. And sometimes it involves a close relationship to another work, but it never becomes known. It never becomes overt in what is the final thing, such as we think about things being final.
I see Kevin has a hand up.
Yeah, actually, Michael, beginning to talk about the finality of work brings to mind when you're looking back on a career and making a selected, what are some of the challenges that surface? How did you decide what to include, what to leave out? Did that change over time? Were there different mixes before you settled on those that made it in?
Yeah, part of it was just, kind of how you recognize yourself as a poet. over 40 years. And then the other is, are you telling a story of how you think you developed, or how and also a story of your obsessions, and how some of the obsessions appeared very early on and remained so, but maybe they developed a little bit. And then at the same time, you don't want too many poems about the same obsession, because that's pretty boring. Yeah, it was an interesting process. And then ultimately it was one of just realizing that, you have to give a lot of, in making this book, you have to give a lot of stuff up. And that probably was harder than anything else. To know that you look at the book and I see what was left out as well. And that's a part of what I talk about, the private, what the maker has, as opposed to the reader.
You see the missing mountain as well as the missing mountain.
Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the things I tried to do was to have the most recent work first, because I felt somehow that's what I identify most with. And so I would want a reader to move from that, going back. And then what do you do with the new poems? I just put them at the end rather than at the beginning. Yeah.
As a reader, I liked that choice a lot, Michael. Exactly that, because I felt like it gave me a new way to think, or it gave me a different way to think about the very new poems. I loved basically like reading backwards, like meeting some poems that I had met a long time ago and being like, oh, hi, like there you are. And seeing them in that continuum and then hitting the new work. Yeah, that was just exciting. I don't know if other people had that experience. If you've been, I mean, I was lucky because I got to see this book early, right? Like, so it's still new. So I don't know if y'all have it yet, but.
Well, on that note, I think I'm gonna go ahead and officially stop the recording, close things out, but feel free to hang around and chat a little bit. Let's give an official round of applause to Chai and Michael. Definitely check out Green and the Missing Mountain. Support the Seminary Co-op if you can, they're great. Also on the Chicago Press blog tomorrow, we'll have a blog post going live with Chai and Michael and also Lloyd Schwartz, all discussing their new collections. So head to press.uchicago.edu sometime tomorrow. It'll be up on there. All right, I'm going to stop the recording, but feel free to hang out.